the fact that I'm going to be training as a priest in a couple of months shocks me and surprises me every morning, and is just weird for a whole number of reasons. One of the things I've come across that's strange about this particular life situation is that people sort of make presumptions about who you are, what your background is, when they hear that you're going to be training as a priest, which is something I hadn't quite expected. At the last church that I worked at, well, I've given it away now, so you know which one. The last church I worked at, someone came up to me once and said, "So you're from a very religious family, if you're going to be a priest?" And I said, "No, that's not actually true. No, my family are not religious at all, actually. I don't know where you got that from, just presuming that I'm from a very religious family." And he said, "Oh, well," he kept trying. He said, "Oh, well, you went to a very religious school then, of course, if you're going to be a priest." I said, no, secular school. I don't get this whole assumption that because you're going to be a priest, you must have been on this sort of conveyor belt of religiousness since you were born, of religious school, religious family. It's simply not true for me, unfortunately in some ways. I first read the Bible when I was 18. I ordered it on Amazon. And I started reading Mark's Gospel because it was short and had Jesus in it, and I had some intuition that he was important. That was my first experience of Jesus, of reading the Bible, and it was a shock for me, to be honest, because Jesus is really difficult. You just heard tonight, let the dead bury their own dead. I mean, that's not exactly pastorally sensitive. Jesus is a really challenging, kind of prickly, controversial character. He offends people fairly regularly, is quite controversial, breaks social conventions, gets into fights with Pharisees, and labels his own generation a faithless generation. That's something that struck me when I first began to explore Christian faith, when I first began to read the Bible. And it's something that Christians have been aware of, to be honest, since the early church. If you look at the documents, the early church documents for this text that Jack just read, there's an awareness that Jesus is difficult, because there's links made in the early church reflections on this between Jesus and Elijah, the wild prophet Elijah, who appears in our Old Testament reading that Jacob read. They recognize that Jesus is not like a calm, mild-mannered rabbi who just teaches his students Torah interpretation. They related him more to a wild, unkept, unpredictable prophet figure. Someone that you have to give everything to follow after, not just sit and learn things from. And that's true also of modern Christian interpretations. It flows on into closer to our own time, representations of Jesus. For example, in C.S. Lewis, in the Chronicles of Narnia, we have famously the Jesus figure of Aslan. Aslan sort of represents Jesus in the Chronicles of Narnia. And he's famously not a tame lion. Indeed, in one passage, it goes, "Aslan is a lion, the great lion." "Ooh," said Susan. "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous meeting a lion." "Safe," said Mr. Beaver. "Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you." So there's this continuing awareness throughout Christian history, my own experience included, that Jesus is the sort of unsafe, untame, a bit wild and disturbing and controversial and challenging figure. And that's very much on display in our reading today. So let's just see how that plays out. The reading opens with Jesus setting his face to go to Jerusalem. He's firmly resolved, that means firmly resolved, to fulfill his mission that ends in the cross in Jerusalem. And that's kind of an intriguing opening, but it's something I'll come back to later on. For now, I'm interested in how he gets to Jerusalem. And he gets there pretty much by offending people. He starts off going through Samaria. And Samaria is this region between Galilee and Jerusalem, and it's inhabited by people who have a different religious tradition from the Jews. They even have a different temple, actually. They recognize a different temple. And so they're not on good terms with the Jews, really. Most Jews going to Jerusalem from Galilee would go around Samaria. But Jesus, being this sort of controversial figure, decides to go straight through. And not only that, he sends messengers ahead to announce that he's coming through this area with a different religion and a different temple. I'm going to go to my temple in Jerusalem and make way. And unsurprisingly, they don't roll out the red carpet for him. He's not welcome in Samaria. That's controversy number one, if you like. In response to that, Jesus' disciples decide to get some justice for him. Fair enough. He's been sort of dissed by the Samaritans. And they want to bring down some fiery justice on this village. But Jesus then gets into controversy with his disciples. He rebukes them. That's quite a strong word, actually. Usually in the Gospels, Jesus saves his rebuking for demons and for illnesses and even for storms sometimes. But here he rebukes his disciples. So it's only the first leg of the journey, and Jesus is already in conflict with both the Samaritans and his own disciples. The picture that we get of Jesus on the road to Jerusalem is not of like a palatable prophet. He's not a crowd-pleasing evangelist. He's not this guy with all the good news and all the blessings. He's, if you like, a divine disruptor. He's challenging and needling and, English people would say, rubbing people up the wrong way in his behavior, essentially, offending people and proclaiming a kingdom of God that's going to shake up the world, which involves him doing a lot of shaking people up, essentially. So that in the end, spoiler, if you haven't here for Easter, the challenge he poses to everyone he meets is such that the Jewish authorities and the Roman occupation both team up in signing his death warrant. So Jesus, this controversial, difficult figure who goes around challenging and disrupting everyone. But into all that, despite that characteristic of Jesus, three people in our reading in the last half want to follow him. They want to follow this wild Messiah. And true to character, Jesus challenges them too. He says to the first who wants to follow him, it's going to mean being unwelcome like me. Foxes have their holes and birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Jesus is not welcome, not comfortable. He's homeless and dislocated, and following him will mean stepping into that way of life, that pattern of being a pilgrim people, being a nomadic people, being a people who famously are in the world but not of the world. That's what it means, he says. If you want to follow me, it's going to cost your comfort. It's going to cost your comfort. The second, and perhaps most controversial encounter, comes as Jesus wants to show that following him takes priority over even the most legitimate and important family duties. So this man only wants to bury his father, right? Quite a legitimate request, you would think. It may be that his father has literally just passed away and is dead on the floor, or that his father is close to death and he wants to make preparations for his funeral, or even that he's been buried for a year, and following Jewish custom requires reburial in a bone box. So it could be any of these things. But whatever the circumstances, it's clear that this incident fits with other sort of extreme hyperbolic encounters between Jesus and other people. The point being that even the most legitimate excuse cannot delay following him. Finally, in the last encounter, Jesus says that like a farmer ploughing his field, discipleship requires total commitment. It requires no looking back. It can't be put as the next thing on the to-do list, even if the first thing on the to-do list is saying goodbye to my family. So again, we have that shock value of the way of discipleship costing total commitment. In the words of William Blake, it demands my soul, my life, my all. In the very next passage, after our reading, Jesus is sending out his disciples on mission. And so we might read these three incidents as like an introduction, a prologue to what it means to be a disciple of Jesus before he sends people out on mission. It means putting discipleship before welcome and comfort. It means putting discipleship before legitimate duties to family and our relationships. Now, those challenging words would probably have reflected the real experience of Jesus' first disciples of giving up comfort and family. And unfortunately, they still reflect the reality for many Christians today, as we read recently that persecution of Christians in the world has reached near genocide levels. Yet for me, coming to Christian faith in the modern West, reading these extreme illustrations of costly total discipleship were difficult. They really shook me up. Prioritizing Christ even above family, above comfort. I wasn't sure what to make of that, really. I sort of realize, a short time into my Christian journey, that my default position, if you like, is not costly discipleship, it's comfortable discipleship. Recently, when I got the call that I'd be going to train as a priest, after, of course, the shock at the responsibility, then, I thought about the accommodation. A nice house, I get an office and a washing machine and stairs. It's very lovely. But I recognize the tension there, that's my default, right, comfortable discipleship. And what Jesus is saying is the discipleship is costly discipleship. It's discipleship that demands something of me. So how do I get from comfortable discipleship to costly discipleship? Or, to be more realistic, how do I sort of begin to shift slowly in that general direction of a discipleship that makes demands on me, that makes an impact, if you like, on the world, rather than one that is comfortable actually where it is? Well, late on in my Christian journey, I began to realize that this might be the reason for the difficult Jesus, for the controversial figure. See, Jesus, as we saw, is always challenging people. He's always shaking people up. He's disruptive and prodding and probing and pushing people all the time. And to be honest, with passages like the one we read today, it's difficult to stay comfortable when you read that Jesus, when you let in the voice of that particular figure. It's difficult to remain in your comfort zone. Maybe that's the point. See, I've been reading Jesus' controversial and irritating moments, thinking, oh gosh, Jesus, if only you wouldn't say these awful things that challenge my own values and presumptions and reasonable priorities. But I've begun to wonder if Jesus is not just accidentally confronting and irritating, but made that an intentional part of his ministry. Perhaps the only way we shift towards a more radical and costly discipleship is by letting Jesus confront us and challenge us, as he did with his disciples in Samaria. Letting him shake us out of our comfortable positions that we fall into. Comfortable positions like privilege and authority that we hear Jesus challenging when he says, the first will be last and the last will be first. Let that comfort exist when Jesus is challenging in that way. It's a difficult thing to do. Or when we make our success based on popularity, and then we hear Jesus saying, I left the 99 to save the one. That's what the Good Shepherd does. How do we maintain popularity as our priority if we let Jesus challenge us like that? When we make our legitimate and worthy priorities in life, we remember Jesus' challenge to take up our crosses and follow him to Jerusalem. Indeed, that's, if you like, the direction that all of Jesus' disruptions seem to push us in. Remember how our reading opened. He set his face to go to Jerusalem. Now, 3 times that's repeated. It's the direction that all the confrontations have when they happen. He's so focused on going to Jerusalem, on fulfilling God's purpose on the cross, that he pushes away all other competing priorities. He goes the direct route. He doesn't let the disciples get sidetracked in Samaria. He warns people wanting to join him of the cost of a journey that ends at the cross. Constantly, Jesus is disruptive and difficult and prodding and pushing, but it's not random. He's constantly shaking people out of their comfort zones and their alternative priorities and turning their faces with his to Jerusalem, to the cross, to the epicenter of what it means to be a costly, cross-bearing disciple. Jesus is, and there's no getting around it, a wild and uncomfortable figure. He's a human hurricane, storming in one direction, blowing everything else out of the way. And we can either let him knock us over, or we can adjust our sails and allow him to push us in the direction he's going, in the direction of Jerusalem. If we make it part of our spiritual practice to immerse ourselves in the gospel stories, especially the difficult ones about Jesus, to allow his difficult, disruptive voice into our prayer life, into our spiritual life, then Jesus might begin to challenge us to move just a little by little, in the direction of costly discipleship, that real discipleship that he's aiming for. By being open to the challenges of Jesus, we grow closer to him as his disciples. We find in the way of discipleship a relationship with someone who, in the words of Mr. Beaver, is not safe. He's not safe, but he's good. He went to Jerusalem to take up that cross for each of our sakes and challenges us to follow in the same way of costly, cross-bearing, self-giving love for others. And so my prayer tonight, as I get ready to leave this parish, for myself and for all of us, is that we might let Jesus be difficult. Let Jesus challenge us, listen to that disruptive, pushing voice, and let it transform us. Amen.